And if anyone is amazed at the mighty power of nature, then they should realize that the Creator is even more powerful.
What's up, guys? It's Johnny Candido of Candido Training HQ. Today's video is on mirroring in your lifts. So what I mean by this is emulating ascent and descent to where they align. And this is something that is very simple, but very few people actually check this and check this in an objective way. They just watch themselves squat, maybe looking back at an iPhone video. If you even record yourself lifting, you're already ahead of 90% of people. But then a lot of times they just watch it and go like, oh, was my brace good? Did my hips rise too fast? Without looking at it in a very detached way. So my main tip is to just actually do what you know you probably should do, but maybe you aren't doing, which is to take a screenshot, or if you're uploading it to YouTube, have two tabs pulled up and have the same vertical position in terms of where the bar displacement is, and simply take a screenshot of both and then go back and forth to each and look at an objective marker in the background to compare where your joint is in relation to that. So this is what I do every single time I form check someone, is if I'm form checking their squat, I'm looking to see where their knee joint is in relation to an object in the background, if it's significantly pushed back. For example, in this one, it was, and it's a very clear answer then. What we need to do is we need to have a more hip dominant descent, but then on the long term, work on high bar squats, hack squats, and leg extensions to build up the strength to then have a more forward knee position, which we do eventually want to work towards. And that's important to do both, because if you do only one and you just train the more hip dominant style and embrace it, then you'll go like, hell yeah, now you feel more confident. You see all the time, tall lifters will share a diagram saying, oh, if you're tall and you have long femurs, you actually need to bend over more. And it's like, okay, we get it, but are you also just neglecting the quad strength? So a lot of times what will happen if you embrace your strengths is you'll hit PRs for the next 3 months, but then you'll plateau for the next 9 months. So that combination is incredibly important. And then when it comes to the bench press, what you often see is when someone's elbow is too inside of their wrist and they're overly tucked, you'll see that unravel on the ascent, then they start to flare their elbows out. But on the descent, they're all super tucked in. And even though you do want to bench press in a J-curve pattern, you still don't want that. You do want to also load your pecs sufficiently on the descent, especially on a wider grip bench, but even on a moderate grip bench press, you want to maintain alignment in both ways, because even if you're, let's say you're touching a little bit lower and then you're pressing a little bit higher, you can still have relative alignment that whole time with your elbows and wrists. So there really is no excuse for it. And again, this is something where it's very simple. Everybody can do it. Maybe a lot of people know to do it, but how often are you actually doing it? And that's why I recommend for this video to share it with anybody who's not actually checking their form in this way. If you do need your form checked, there's actually right now submissions to form checks in the Candido Forever program, and I check absolutely 100% of people who will submit today. So if you join and submit, you will 100% be in the video, and that'll take however long it's needed to check everything that I always look for in your technique. So this brings me to my second point. And the second point is understanding what are necessary joint alignments and what are unnecessary joint alignments. So what I mean by this is that there are some rules that truly do matter as far as textbook technique. A lot of times people throw out everything, especially now with pain science and with understanding that individuals move very differently. Form doesn't predict injury really to any extent that's been proven so far. Things like that are true. And we're not trying to adjust our technique just for injury prevention. We're trying to adjust it also to be as strong as possible, or mostly just for efficiency's sake, to be as strong as humanly possible. And with that, then that really matters as far as some of these positions. So like I said, the elbow alignment over the wrist on the bench press bottom position, I would say is probably the most common mistake that is an objective rule that should, if not be followed, should be followed as well as you can tolerate the internal rotation of the shoulder joint. So for example, especially if you have a max grip with bench press, obviously your elbows aren't literally going to be directly stacked under your wrist joint. That's just the nature of the lift. However, you can get it as effectively as possible relative to, like I said, what you can tolerate. And then also, if you're overly tucked, you can decide one of two things. Either you can just bring your grip within and embrace that and say, hey, maybe you do feel better, you get your lats tighter, you feel stronger in that position. but then bring your grip width in, and that's where then we have to count on the fact that now you don't have as much room for those elbows to flare way out. So you either bring your grip width in to match where your elbows are, or you bring your elbows out to match where your wrists are. You make that decision. Now, a second one, and this is one that obviously a lot of people know, is that when it comes to your scapula, it has to be directly over the bar. When it comes to deadlifting, there's no way around that. And then on the squat and deadlift, just in general, your midfoot needs to be aligned with the bar, and you want generally a straight bar path. Now, this again is where looking at rep to rep difference is so important, because what happens a lot of times is on the second rep and beyond, the bar path is better, whereas on the first rep, you see all the time where a low bar position is actually a little bit too far back over the heels. So then that person's a little bit more forward, which is actually what we want. We want that forefoot pressure down earlier in both the squat and deadlift, typically, than what most people do. Both the sumo deadlift, a lot of times people benefit from emphasizing the forefoot. Like my friend Sean Noriega, for example, you can see him really emphasize getting in his forefoot. And then on the squat, I think it's one of the biggest corrections is to focus on that forefoot so that then when you squat down, it's a natural, almost feels like jumping even in a low bar squat. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of people feel more natural high bar squatting, especially general strength training enthusiasts. And myself and historically. But once you really get used to this with a low bar and be very intentional with shifting your whole system forward, not just your hips back, but actually shifting your balance forward more initially while standing, then you can start to have almost a high bar feeling low bar squat. And the final mandatory rule is bracing in the position that you aim to maintain. That one is critical, regardless of your deadlift style, whether you're someone with upper back rounding, with scapular protraction, whether you're with someone who has lumbar flexion, and you know you do, and you're just stronger in that position, which is absolutely a valid option. What we want is for you to brace into that position and then maintain it so that then you're repeating it across loads, which increases the trainability of or the adaptation to that position. And that's actually going to decrease injury. A lot of times people get injured not because they're in a position that's inherently dangerous, but because they get knocked into a position that they're not previously trained in. And then that fact alone is why you get hurt. So you need to be able to then get into that position and embrace in it and then be strong in it. And that's one where there really is no justification for not doing this. And it is something you have to fight to find that position and to get strong in it, brace in it, whether you have to have a higher belt position or lower belt position. That's where some of those individual differences do come in. But the principle that you want to maintain it so that 70% looks like 80%, looks like 90%, and looks like 100% is absolutely true. And I've actually seen some pain science people say that, oh, there was a study that position inherently changes from 80% to 90% to 100%, which is true. There was a study on that load does dictate that. But that's not something you should just accept just because the average person does that. Just because, a study of a handful of people do it. It's like, yeah, well, most people suck, and there's always room to improve for everyone, and no one's perfect. So it doesn't necessarily mean just throw everything out and give up. So those are the issues where I do push back on some of the nihilism that people have. And I'll actually show a great example on the screen of a recent form check that I've had where I basically told him about his hip position. This pelvic tilt was such that he wasn't going to be able to maintain it in the bottom position. And he was already in anterior pelvic tilt with excessive extension in his lumbar spine as a result of that pelvic tilt. And then in the bottom position, most people are going to have a slight amount of lumbar flexion, even if you start totally neutral. So in that case, it is objective that you would just be better off having your pelvis tilt a little bit more forward so you get a little bit more neutral, stop ducking out as much, and then you have a bigger range of motion on your hip flexion and extension. And there is no real argument against that. So again, it's all about finding out first those objective points that are indisputable and then working our way down this list. So now let's get into some unnecessary joint alignments. So these are some of the softer spots. And one thing that really needs to be reiterated is that movement is your joints not aligning. That is what movement is. That's what it entails. So sometimes you can almost get the sense that we should be perfectly stacked in everything we do, but then perfectly stacked would just be standing straight up and down. So we are trying to move, and we're trying to move some heavy ass weight. Now that being said, what I would consider to be the unnecessary joint alignment where it's really individual would be, first of all, knee caving in the squat. That one, I think a lot of people have been accepting that it is inevitable. It is, for example, higher in female lifters due to the Q angle of their hips. That we know very well. And it's also just common in general, men, male and female, when it comes to raw powerlifting. Now, the extent, again, you have to play around. When it comes to extent, you have to simply look at your actual feedback from your own body as far as pain sensitivity and how strong you're feeling. And those are going to be king rather than just saying, okay, because your knees went in, like we're going to scrap this or we're going to even adjust technique. You may not even have to change stance width at all with that. Now, neutrality of your spine is, again, another one that is completely open to the lifter, is that there is no real reason to fear some extent of even dynamic underload spinal flexion and extension, even including the lumbar spine. So another one is from the front,
so that your shins end up at 90 degrees when your foot position should be on sumo, is to look into a mirror, get into your starting position.
And that's kind of how I sumo deadlifted all my life, and now I'm never going to pull sumo again, as my most recent video discussed. So what was it even for? But no, I'm just kidding. Obviously, I'm happy with everything I did sumo. But that's another one where if you have a really wide sumo, you are simply making the decision that you're just going to bias other areas where there's going to be more pressure on your body, and that's completely fine. So there is no real inherent reason that because your knees are inside your ankles that all of a sudden that's too wide of a stance width. What we really want to look for in that case is just, can you have even pressure across your feet, and then matching your toe angle to ensure that is the next step. So just make sure that you can justify the position that you're in, but it's not inherently wrong. So it's not inherently wrong to be out of alignment. And another one of the unnecessary joint alignments, I would say, is the extent of the J curve on the bench press. That one really does vary by individual. And actually, the wider you grip on your bench press, since your wrists and elbows won't be perfectly aligned, it also is going to alter the way that your bar path works. So basically, the wider you grip, the more straight up and down actually your bar path will be. So it still will be a little bit of a J curve, especially right off the chest. But the typical study used, that even I use with Bill Kazmaier, it's using a heavy lifter who sinks a lot and is going to really toss that weight up. So that's going to be very exaggerated compared to someone like Daiki Kadoma, who's a very tight Japanese bench presser.
I am going to eat this little Chinese boy.
Benching 500 pounds at 163 pounds.
Another world record and another world championship for Daiki Kadama.
And then lastly is symmetry. Now this one is an edge case because I will say I think symmetry falls under the it's always ideal to be symmetrical, because there really isn't an argument for intentional asymmetry as far as because it's not more efficient in terms of strength either, unless you have a more muscular left hamstring or something. But odds are we don't want to get into that psychological game of overthinking things in that way. So we do want things to be symmetrical, but again, it's not indicative of injury, at least to any evidence up until now. And our bodies are inherently asymmetrical down to our organs. Greg Nuckols has a fantastic article on this topic. So I consider this to be an edge case where I wouldn't say it's absolutely necessary to be symmetrical, but I do think it's worth working on in the background because it could prevent an injury if you're building up it through accessory work or through light, even mobility work that's at least loaded to a point where you can progress. That's the important part. That is still worth doing. So again, that's the edge case one where it's not necessary, but it's worth looking at. Now up next, we have tempo. And this is one where I am a huge believer that tempo should be 100% determined by your past training data. And not any one video saying like, oh, going faster on the descent bench really is working out. Because it does for some people, and for other people it doesn't. What you have to do is you have to trust both on rep work and on 1 rep maxes. But typically 1 rep maxes will tell you the most. Trust that. If you clearly hit your best when going really aggressively on bench press, then you should aim to replicate that even on all rep sets, all volume sets, and do not deviate from it just because you feel fatigued. Sometimes it's very tempted to start changing things, especially when you're a little bit more fatigued, deep into a prep, but you always have to trust that that swing back is going to come, because almost certainly it will. So tempo is the one point where I would not look to any other lifter as your example, and I would not look to any textbook answer as your example. I would 100% look at past training data more than any of these other points. Now, this brings me to the final point. The final one is, are you an outlier or are you lying to yourself? So what I mean by this is it's very important to always look at what are strong people actually doing. And this is why it's so important to follow lifters either on YouTube, on Instagram, and just watch how they actually lift. A lot of times people say something and don't do it at all. Two great examples here running the Candido Forever program, and one of them is Justin. So Justin came to me asking about his squat, and he was asking about knee discomfort, which actually very rarely do I attribute that to technique. Usually I attribute that to programs, even if it's my programs. I just go, okay, I admit maybe we should adjust something. But when I watched his squat, I saw something. He squatted so upright, so quote unquote perfectly, with his knees perfectly out, it looked like a Squat University ad. And let's be real, Squat University he's not strong. he's just not a strong man. And then the other person who I thought of as an example who squats with this really knees out, more upright, but really hip dominant and upright style, it's Kelly Starrett. And Kelly Starrett is also not strong, especially when squatting to depth with a raw squat. Nobody squats like Kelly Starrett as a high level lifter. None of them. And that's something that is so underrated, because you could look at all of these points and still just squat with a very outlier style. And you just have to ask yourself, why is nobody doing that? Because they're probably stronger squatting, just differently. So from a side angle especially, you can see his squat is so upright, it truly could be a front squat in terms of torso angle. I actually don't think it would change his torso angle at all if he did have this in a front squat position. So even though you are high bar squatting, you still want to use your hips, you still want to use your strong glutes to hip extend and to get a rebound that's a balance. And that's why I told him that Clarence Kennedy is a great example of this, where he's a very deep high bar squatter, but look at how much more athletic he is while actually being in a little bit more of a forward leaned position. So that is something that is so underrated, is to just check yourself and say, am I in line with what people who are doing this full go and have been kind of selected for in this very rigorous process? The last people standing in IPF Worlds are only people who have done a lot of things correctly. Yes, they are genetic anomalies, and maybe they're built a little bit differently than you, and some of them aren't super smart or super into coaching or anything like that. Some people just are gifted, but they are doing a lot of things correctly. And if nobody's squatting super duper upright in that class, then odds are it's just not the way to squat. Now, a great example the other way is a lifter named Rupesh, who again is also on the Forever program. In his deadlift style, he was asking me if he should be concerned about his position. Is he a little bit too forward rounded, or what's going on here? And I actually think it's completely fine, because I've seen a handful of lifters deadlift with the style and have absolutely no injury issues. But also specifically, there's a lifter named Tyson Reidenhauer, who's a super strong TikTok deadlifter, and he's done a meet and he's deadlifted over 800 pounds, in a competition, and he's pulled around 1,000 off the floor in very TikTok conditions. But he has exactly that same kind of upper back position, probably even more extreme. Now, obviously, it's going to depend on your genetics, but that's one thing that cannot be emphasized enough, is some people just are built differently to where their neutral position is fundamentally a different position. So it's not even necessarily that they're protracting more, it's that might actually be neutral. That isn't protracted. And then, obviously, maybe they do also add a little bit on top of that. But everyone's neutral looks completely different. And I have had experience trying to get someone like this to pull snatch grip deadlifts and to really force a little bit more of an extended upper back position. And usually that's actually what's going to risk injury. So he also asked me about if his pause deadlift duration was sufficient. And that's the type of guy where I can say off the top, his pause off the floor is probably not going to be an issue, because his limiting factor is not even probably going to be off the floor. In that case, it's probably going to be upper back strength in the long run and hip strength, to where Romanian deadlifts will likely get his strength up, because you see that type of person so much, where okay, that's someone with very good leverage off the floor, very long limbs, and then at that knee and above knee level, that's where the limiting factor is going to be, and then you can bias everything in knowing that. So overall, hopefully that this made it very clear on how to check yourself when it comes to form, because it's a mix. That yes, there's some textbook form that should apply to everyone, but really the number one rule is what I said, is that eccentric and concentric mirroring is by far the most important thing. That, I would say, is the one objective rule, especially in the squat, that really everyone should seek to emulate. And then from there, you go to the textbook points, then to a little bit less textbook points, then your own personal history, and then you compare yourself to the elite lifters and say, am I doing something that's actually efficient in the real world? Not just looking good like a Kelly Shred squat just because it looks aesthetic. And no, it's about actual results. So that's it, guys. Make sure to like the video, support the channel. And again, if you want your form checked, link is in the description. Have a great day, guys. Peace.